Imagine you're given a budget and you have to spend that budget on different types of things that could be used to go to war with against another nation. Now, many of you would be thinking, okay, well, I'll buy an aircraft carrier, I'll buy bombers, I'll buy means to deploy troops. And so that's what the general public would think of as war, right? How do you take over a country with weapons? So you're given a budget and you spend, I'm guessing the majority of people would spend a significant portion on the utilities used for waging war, like bombs, guns, fighter jets, and those sort of things. But if we go to the experts now in this field, they're given a budget, right? They don't actually spend it on aircraft carriers. They don't actually spend it on the tools used for waging war. What they spend the money on, you can do this for any war game. The majority of the war game, when they're given a budget, the generals, they actually spend it, especially in the United States, by the way. They spend it on something called targeted diplomacy or public diplomacy. Essentially, what that means is the war they're engaging in is information and about diplomacy and about persuading other nations to join the cause, to sell the war to other countries. And so that could come by diplomatic relations, through backdoor dealing, through online activity, through media, through many means, through conferences, international conferences. But the majority of the top generals, they spend their money on targeted diplomacy, information warfare, basically, to persuade other nations to sell the war to other nations and to galvanize the world internationally against specific nations. And so only really America has the economic, political, and political power to engage with something like that. We may refer to things like the war on terror, for example, and how that became a buzzword, right? The war on terror, which then moved into taking down Saddam Hussein. And you had that whole narrative of war on terror and WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and a whole vilification process of Saddam, which then ended up with the removal of him from power. And the last phase of this vilification and pretext, which was the WMD narrative, weapons of mass destruction narrative, the whole idea of that, the whole culmination of that was the physical bombing and removal of Saddam Hussein. But wars start not with bombs. Wars start with ideas, ideology. People have to be persuaded to join the cause. People have to be sold into a war narrative of evil versus good, let's just say, of freedom versus tyranny, whatever you want to call it. But people have to be sold, and people have to be galvanized to take a stand, to support their governments and things like that, you know? And so vilification is also a very important tool, because take, for example, the war with Venezuela that's taking place as we speak. The war talk, let's just say, there's not been a war yet, but that could very well change as of the posting of this video. But one of the things that happened was the United States government declared the Maduro regime part of a narco-terrorist organization. So he's labeled the Venezuelan regime as narco-terrorists. And then he said, we're engaging in a war with narco-terrorism. So there's a war with narco-terrorism, and all of Maduro's regime is labeled as narco-terrorists. Essentially, that opens up a whole bunch of war powers that because America's at war with narco-terrorism and Maduro is a narco-terrorist, those narco-terrorists are considered enemy combatants. So they can be, which opens up a whole bunch of powers, which means that people can essentially be killed as enemy combatants rather than tried and going through a judicial process, which then they are killed. So this use of the word narco-terrorism and war on drugs has labeled all those who participate in drugs as terrorists, as enemy combatants, which means that they can be taken out without trial or any judicial process. And so all of Maduro's regime has basically been labeled that. And so what you have there is an example of vilification, which leads to being able to do a whole lot of stuff against the country when you vilify the nation, when you demean the nation, when you say that, when you label people as terrorists or drug dealers or part of international drugs or terrorism. And so that label can do a heck of a lot, you know. Now I want to think about the war in heaven for a moment, because the Bible does describe a war in heaven that's been brought down to earth. Does it involve vilification? It involves weapons of mass distraction. Not destruction. Distraction. And so many nations, they have intelligence agencies, the CIA, the Mossad, the MI6 in Britain, and many other nations. Even New Zealand has the Five Eyes Information Sharing Alliance and the GCSB. And so all these different nations, whether it's Israel with the Mossad or Britain with the MI6, and America with the CIA, and New Zealand with its information sharing alliances, all of these nations have information sharing and intelligence gathering agencies, which then become the vehicles by which war is justified and pushed to be sold, so that the population can buy into the war narrative. And that's how these things take place. And so ideology is a big part of war. It's not just as simple as bombing people, you know. All the intelligence agencies around the world were saying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Then the media pushed it out there. Look at all these reports and started building this narrative of Saddam Hussein as a crazy man with weapons of mass destruction. Turns out there was none. You know? Now we have the narrative of narco-terrorism, you know. Maduro is a drug dealer and Venezuela is engaging in narco-terrorism and engaging in pushing drugs to the United States. And so we'll just declare all drug dealers as part of narco-terrorism, which means that we can take them out as enemy combatants without a judicial process. It's the same sort of thing, you know. And that involves vilification. And so I'd like to talk about a war in heaven for a moment. It's called a war in heaven. We're taking it from the physical to the spiritual now. It says in Revelation chapter 12, verse 7 and 8, there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. What is the war? Well, let's take it down to earth for a moment here. You know, the devil does not want casualties. He wants converts. He wants converts. And take, for example, the Christians of the early church, when they were thrown into lions' dens, when they were put into the Colosseum, when they were burned as human torches, when they were beheaded, when they were crucified. What was trying to be done? Was the devil aiming for casualties? No, because at any moment these things could stop. What do I mean by that? Well, they could stop if the Christians decided to sprinkle a little bit of incense to Caesar, acknowledging his divinity. But they wouldn't do that, so they took the other. They would go through the other option, which was to be martyred, to suffer as a martyr's death. So the devil had this option of deny your faith or be killed. You see, it wasn't just a matter of killing Christians. It was a matter of let's make them deny their faith, and that's the primary goal. And if that doesn't work out, then let's throw them put them in the Colosseum. And so that was the idea. It was an ideological component to the persecution, to the warfare that the devil was waging against the church. It was about changing one's mind away from God to the emperor, to ultimately to Satan, And this is nothing new, I mean, even during the reign of Babylon, the king Nebuchadnezzar sets up this golden image and says everyone should worship this golden image. And people decided not to. People who were true to their faith, and they were said to, you have to be now burnt with fire. And so there's always this conflict here of betray your morals, and then the government setting up a test to test the boundaries to see if there will be people who comply with the moral breaking or those who just toe the line, And in the time of Babylon, people, the Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, three Hebrew boys, decided not to bow down to the image, were to be thrown into a fiery furnace. And so, early church, right? Sprinkle a little bit of incense to Caesar, acknowledge him as a god, and you will not be killed. Bow down in the time of Babylon. Bow down to this idol, and if you don't, you'll be burnt. Or even in the time of the Iranian regime, the Persian regime, worship the king as a god, worship no other god except the king as a god, and if you don't, you'll be thrown into a lion's den and eaten by lions. So you had these things in society occur where it's like, just do this evil act, just engage in violating your own morals, and everything will be okay. But if not, you're getting persecuted. So there's this ideological component to war, to this satanic warfare that's been engaged against God's people. He wants people to compromise. He wants people to give up their morals, give up their principles. And that's the whole rationale behind persecution, to give up God, to give up Jesus for one's life, in order to save one's life, which really is losing it, because you lose it in the hereafter, right? And so the Bible says that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. When the early Christians were being martyred, being thrown to lions and so on and so forth, they did not relinquish their faith. And when people like Huss were burnt at the stake, he did not relinquish his faith. When people like the Waldenses were being persecuted, they did not relinquish their faith. They were persecuted in the mountains in the Alps. So there's this conflict going on between compromise of principles, and there is a time coming when there will be a time when no one is able to buy or sell unless they worship the image of the beast. Same as Babylon, right? Worship this golden image, and if you don't worship it, be thrown in the fire. Same as Persia. Worship the king. If you don't worship him, you're in the lion's den. This power that to come in the end times, no buying or selling. You're going to get persecuted if you don't submit to the beast system, which is the image of the beast, which is this false system that's going to emerge, which will cause people to deny their faith in some way, and these are the things that take place in the world, and this is the warfare that's being waged in the world by the devil. And so the warfare I'm talking about is a warfare that's about changing people's mind, persuading people to either follow one way or another way. And so all these wars are being fought, with guns and bombs, and there is an information component to it, there is an ideological component to it, there is a persuasion component to it, with things like targeted diplomacy, with things like vilification. But the ultimate warfare is about you, and whether you as an individual will compromise your principles, compromise your beliefs as a Christian, or whether you will succumb, whether you will not compromise and seek to go down the path of persecution. Yes. And so, my friends, I guess Christians were vilified. Christians were vilified. They were seen as a cause of all the trouble that's happening in the empire during the Roman times. Christians were vilified. They blamed all sorts of natural calamities and disasters on Christians who were not sprinkling incense to Caesar, who were not obeying the government in every regard, even when they were causing people to violate the laws of God. And so that vilification led to persecution, and that persecution was conditional on whether you compromise your faith and no more persecution, or whether you stick to your faith, in which case you'll be inflicted with civil penalties. So the dragon's all about vilification and persecution. And so when it talks about the enemy speaking like a dragon, it's a persecuting power, it's a lying power, it's something that character assassinates you in order to make people turn against you, And that's the trajectory of warfare. That's how warfare has been in the 21st century and even in the 20th century. It's about ideological struggles, vilification, good versus evil, who controls the narrative. Who controls the narrative. And so I would encourage us as Christians to not be so quick to worry about WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, but rather keep an eye out and ears open to WMDs, weapons of mass distraction. Because that's where it is. That's where it is. Every Roman circus that's out there called sports, every video that's engaging in the exposition of information, it's a war for the mind. It's a war for the mind. Every movie that's promoting some sort of a narrative, that's promoting some sort of a philosophy, some sort of an idea, there's always a plot. There's always a plot. And every news article, there's an agenda. And so in every university, every school, there is something that is being taught that's ideological, that changes your thinking, that influences your perception. Every scroll on TikTok, right, that's taking your time, all of this is part of that information warfare apparatus that the whole world has. And then you have ceremonies too, like the Commonwealth Games, Olympic Games, big international ceremonies and organizations that, whether it's the World Economic Forum or whatever it may be, big international gatherings, hostings, all these things influence our perception, influence public perception, And the enemy in the future is going to use all these different things and is using them now as we speak, but in the future to more of a greater extent, to influence the mind, to persuade us into either disobeying God or obeying God, following His teachings, not following His teaching, compromise or firmness, and so that is the struggle that we're all in. That is the struggle that we're all in, and be aware, be aware. And Jesus says there's many wolves amongst the sheep. And so be aware, be alert. Know that the warfare is spiritual primarily before it gets physical. And take care. God bless.